Hello Renaissance Academy students. Today we are going to work on our last video for the painting animals section for year 2. So today we're going to paint a bird in flight. I have this beautiful white dove with its wings up. You can find any photo online if you want to also do a bird in flight. Obviously you have to work from photos. In this case, I chose this specifically because I wanted to talk about wing anatomy. Many times you'll probably find that you may want to paint a bird in flight or an angel or something, but for whatever reason, you need that knowledge of under the wing. And so I want to demonstrate that in today's video. And I also wanted to capture some of that transparency in the feathers. So we'll play with some of those. This video will not be about color more than it will be about value and just some of that anatomical discussion. Today I have an 11 by 14 canvas. I think this actually would be most stunning on a great big square canvas. I don't have any on hand and I thought, well, I'll just use what I have, but you might want to play around with some ideas like that and some different shapes and see what works for you, and do a small study painting and then see what it might look like on maybe a circle or an octagon or oval. They make all kinds of different shapes of canvases. You can also cut your own if you are using a masonite and your own canvas as well. Okay, so let's get going. Okay, so what I'm going to do here to begin with is I'm not going to tone the canvas this time. I'm just going to take some thinner, and you won't be really seeing much of my palette this time. It's just sitting down here on my lap. And I am going to begin by just drawing the bird in place on my canvas, but I'm using the paint like I normally do because it's easier to move around than a pencil and an eraser. So the first thing I want to figure out is where she's going to be located. So I'm thinking in this area, I kind of like the idea of this upward projection, even though I don't have a square, which I think might be more interesting. I don't have a square, so I'm going to utilize the space as though she's flying upwards and give that soaring feeling. So if the tip of this wing is here and I put the other one roughly there, that means her head is going to be here and her tail here. So now I need to ask myself, is that too big for the canvas? And I think it's probably going to be a little too large, so I'm going to bring it back down, make it a little smaller. Now the reason I'm choosing to not tone the canvas this time is because I kind of want the white of the canvas to show through in any of these areas because the bird is so clean and white. So I think that if we go with this wing, looking at the V here in the middle of these wings, if it's roughly that, how is that for size and scale? And this is a great painting to use for your negative space, studying that, looking at these gaps behind the bird. So I think I'll work on this drawing measurements better, but so I think if we're in this area, it has the feeling that I'm looking for. So body's up like this, the head, the wing. Still think if this is that big, then maybe I should work on this. So I'd like kind of the bird to be in this vicinity, and this will kind of all be dark. I kind of wish it wasn't quite as low. So maybe I will bring the whole thing up just a little. And look at those shapes. Because this is in a perfect square, I can kind of imagine that there's a square that this bird is sitting in, and I'll use, just like we did in year 1, as we studied those negative shapes on that horse jumping and we looked at the background shapes here. same idea here. I'm not worried about the individual feathers at this point. I really just want to get the outline of this whole wing in place. Get all the big angles drawn. Sometimes if I go out like this with my brush strokes, it feels more like a background rather than 14 lines drawn for one line and I don't know which is which. Give yourself a little bit of background in an area and it helps you to isolate that clean form. Now keeping my paint thinned down with a little bit of thinner. Looking at the width of this V that's made up in between these two wings. Things to watch out for when you're painting birds. Look for continuous flowing lines. So try to think about this wing attaching to the body in the same place as this wing attaches on this side. So this little pool in here is just drenched in light, and I really want to get that feeling of it being glowing. So that I'll have to think. I'm not going to draw the bird's back on there, even though we know it's in there. So we'll have to make those mental notes. All I'm using for this painting is just burnt sienna and ultramarine blue and a little white. There's a few tiny spots of color around the eye, the beak, and the feet. And so I'll get those when I am ready for just a tiny little spot of color. But for the most part, that's why I'm not even bothering showing my palette, because it's just all drawing today, values. I actually considered doing this one in watercolor too. So this would be a lovely study, and you can ink, just brush on ink for this whole black background. And I found this image of this dove on the internet, copyright-free images, and you just can scroll down images and look around for something you like. I typed in, my keyword was birds in flight, or bird in flight. If you pluralize it, you get flocks of birds. And so if you just keep it single, you get one bird in flight. Okay, so I'm thinking where this wing ends is going to be about the same as it does on this side. Now in this wing we have the arm, basically, it's the arm of the bird right here, and this is a little darker value. I'll get that more with blue, but for now I'm just going to indicate that this is that passage where the muscles of the bird are working to flap the wing. And then the value gets a little lighter because the feathers get longer, and that lets a little more light in. And I'm already keeping my brush strokes in the direction that the feathers go out, the way they grow out from the wing there. And I can come back through here with a little more detail. One year I did a painting for the duck stamp. I think it was 2009. It was a wood duck, and I did the painting, and the thing about those things is they count every single feather in the duck stamp competition and make sure that everything is exactly like the original bird, which is kind of a neat challenge if you ever want to embrace that challenge. Okay, so that's kind of starting to feel like it's in flight there. I'm looking at the negative space provided by the back of the bird. Under the wing, it comes up like this, and the back comes down. Just looking at that negative space back there. I want to make sure that these don't get too long. What can happen is as you're going along, things can start to get really long, and before you know it, they don't have the same proportions as the rest. So I'm going to take one of these, I'll take this distant wing, and I'll compare the length of that wing down to its head compared to the length of under this wing to the tip. So I'm going to give myself an indication. There's the end of the tail. And I'll compare what I've indicated here for the end of the tail to here, and I'll compare it to this point to this point. Well, actually, okay, so I'll do it on here first. Tip of the brush to the neck, tip of my thumb on the tip of that wing. Now I'm going to put my thumb on the wing here to see where the tip of the brush goes. It's just below the tail. So this wing is just a teeny bit longer than that tail. So there's that wing. And putting my thumb, so I can still bring the tail up just a little bit. Okay, so that distance there is about like that. And I'm looking where the fan of the tail feathers begins compared to what's happening on the top of the bird. And then those long tail feathers connect about there, and they connect about here under the bird. So I just cleaned my brush off and wiped it off to use it as an eraser, just to clean out that angle. I wanted it a slight bit different. Okay. Now before I get into the feet, I'm going to make sure that the rest of this is going to be reading accurately too. So I'll come up here and get the head and neck as accurate as I can. Clean my brush off. This is going to be an eraser now as I get these right where I want them. I'm already thinking ahead about making sure that this distant edge of that wing is soft so that it is obviously behind this wing. I want this wing to be sharp and have clean, crisp edges. So I'm just kind of mentally planning ahead things that I want to be aware of as I get going. Seems like beaks and bird heads tend to be quite a bit of a challenge for people, and I feel it too. So take the time and measure and remeasure and do what you need to do to make sure that you feel good about the head before moving on. So I have it roughly in place. So what I'm going to do now is come back through and measure. I'm going to compare it to, I'll compare the distance from the beak to where that connects to the wing. I'll compare that distance to maybe, I'll go with the width of the tail just to give me something. Or I'll go with the length of the tail. Okay, so from the beak, I know you can't see that, from the beak to that point of the V, and then I'll go down here to the length of the tail. It's right about where it connects to the body right here. So now working backwards, this measurement is the same as from that V to the end of the beak. So I need to bring the head in to there. So I have the head too big. So getting a little bit thinner paint. I'm just gonna take one of these little cheapy brushes. I'm gonna keep this one clear so that this is my eraser brush. This is my dark brush. Eraser. I flick my eye back and forth to the photo image that I'm working from all the time. We really only retain an image just a few seconds in our mind. So don't go off what you think you know, but go off of what you see, and you'll have a much better chance of getting a more accurate rendition. Too often we base a lot of what we do off of assumptions. And that can get us into trouble in a lot of areas. Now I'm thinking about where this muscle that I have from the wing comes down, and there's this plane that's underneath the bird's belly here, and I want to try to capture that feeling of round softness that we've all felt holding a bird, that cool feather touch. Sometimes keeping descriptions like that fresh in your mind help you to better be able to capture that sort of elusive quality that you're looking for. There's that value down here that I'm going to sort of scumble in. Okay, I'm going to stop filming for a minute now while I fill in the whole background with the dark color. Okay, I'm back now, and I've put a very dark, pretty much like a deep navy blue over the background. It's more blackish down here because I used a little bit more sienna into the blue, and up here it's more midnight blue, and I know you can't really see that on the video, but that's what I did. All right, what I'm going to do now is mix up my different piles of gray. So I've got, kind of like I did in the wolf last week, I took ultramarine blue and brown. And I'll show you this here as I'm working. Ultramarine blue and brown. Now I'm going to get different piles of gray going here. So starting with just a nice neutral gray with some blue, brown, almost in equal proportions with some white. And then I can add a little bit more white as I go across this way, so I'll be able to just jump into this and grab it as needed. I may take a little bit of yellow ochre just to warm it up a little bit, keep it from being so cold and sterile. And there are times and places where I probably will take a little bit of cadmium yellow and just hit some of that really sunlit parts on the back of the bird with the bright white with a touch of yellow. Okay, so now I have my different grays mixed up. I am going to look at the bird and decide which passage has the darkest value on it. And I'm going to go into that gray and paint that on. Okay, so there's going to be a little bit of glare on my canvas, but I need the lighting to see what I'm doing on the bird. So squinting down, I'm seeing that right under here is the very darkest of my white values. And I'm keeping this as simplified as possible. And then a little bit of yellow ochre to that as the gray fades a little more beyond into more of these feathers. These are not the flight feathers, but they are just the ones that are underneath, the smaller ones. So look at the different rows. There's the main row that's attached to the arm. Those are the shortest feathers, resembling most the feathers that are on the body. And then the next ones that come out are a little bit longer and stiffer. When I was a kid, I used to pick up our chickens and hold them and examine their wings because I was very much interested in drawing Pegasus. Pegasi? Do you add an I? Because I wanted to get an accurate Pegasus wing, and I don't know, maybe they started looking like chickens. So now I added a little bit more white and yellow ochre to these are coming into the flight feathers now. There's a thinner layer of them, because again, more atmosphere is coming through the feathers. Okay, now this is obviously not the whitest white of that wing, so I'm going to add a very close to it, white, with a little gray in it. I'm going to cover this whole passage, and then I'll come back through later with more detail and carve out the feathers around the background and so forth. I'll even add more of a glow around these feathers as I get closer to that area. Always letting my brush strokes define the form, keeping up with the form of the direction that the feathers are going in. Again, with some of these same grays that I already have on my brush, carving out under this wing. If I squint down at the main body of this bird, I want to be careful that I don't get it too dark and too heavy, and then I'm not able to find the appropriate values. So keeping it, squinting down, I can see better the where the form starts to change shape in here. Transitioning a little bit more into the shadow as the body of the bird starts to turn around. At this point, I'm thinking about the edges, but I'm not worried about getting them in place. Right now, my major concentration is in the values and getting the values exactly where they need to be, because that's what's going to give me the form of this bird. Accurate values. I know that there's a lot of glare on this, but it's almost impossible to not have any glare on here. So I'm hoping that you're still able to get the values and see what I'm doing in regards to that. I'm getting a mostly white, though I'm not cleaning my brush off, so there's a little bit of that grayish residue, but it's mostly white. I'm gonna come up here and get these feathers in place, and this bigger wing up here. Of course, all the flight feathers are like fingers, and each one is very specific. Go. And then I come in on the top part of the wing, right to the same arm that we painted on the underside. And to this wing, I will be adding more of that sunlit, bright, bright, bright white. I want to get the shape of this flight feather exactly right. Feathers are so elegant. Pretty soon I'm going to be switching over to a smaller brush so that I can get into more of the smaller passages of form on here. place and start to refine some of this.
Looking at the distance that this eye is to the top of the head, and also to the beak, and taking into account the cheek, and elsewhere around the face. So taking a little bit of burnt sienna and some yellow ochre, a little white, I'm going to use that to paint in the suggestion of where the beak is going to go. And remember, you can also, which I'm going to paste in here, take the background color and rework some of the drawing.
If your paint is thick enough on your brush, you should be able to paint right over another color as strong as black over white. You don't want to make it too goopy that it's out of control, but you should be able to lay another color down over another color to make a correction. Okay, so now that the bird is pretty much under control, what I'm going to do at this point is go through and do all of the fine tuning of details. I'm going to take the extra time and just go through and really make sure that all of these major curves where the wings, the feathers have their connection. I'm going to make sure that those are all, that they have that nice curvature. I'm going to go through and clean up around the edges, the eyes and whatever, and then I'm going to soften edges and really try to lose some and give this bird a feeling of flight and soft reality. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this in fast forward and work on the details, and you can see it come together with that. All right, I'm going to come back in through here now, and I'm starting to add a little bit more of the feather texture in here. And I don't want to jump away too much from the variations and values, so I want to keep the values very close to what I have existing with just the minor variations, mostly to suggest texture, and that's it. And that pretty much can be without adding too much more paint. Just a matter of moving around these different values. Now again, some of my brush strokes are going, I want to just make sure that they go with the form, and I'll drag this value that I have here into the flight feathers.